machete struck metal where there should have been nothing but forest. The blade bounced back hard, and the man stumbled into a wall of vines. He pulled them apart. Behind it, rusted iron. A gate, 8 feet tall, chained shut, buried in overgrowth. He called the others over. 3 of them stood staring at a gate that wasn't on any map, blocking a road that didn't exist. One pressed his face between the bars and looked down into the valley. He went pale. Down there stood houses, dozens of them, rooftops intact, chimneys standing, a whole settlement sitting in dead silence. The man's name was Ed Calloway. What his team found past that gate became one of the strangest unsolved cases in American history. What made an entire community vanish in a single night without a trace, without a single body left behind? Stay with me on this one. Ed Calloway wasn't a man who spooked easily. He'd been a land surveyor for the state of Oregon for 19 years by the time this happened. Most of that time he spent in rough backcountry, thick timber, terrain that hadn't seen a boot print in decades. He'd dealt with collapsed mine shafts, rattlesnake dens, washouts that turned solid ground into mud rivers overnight. Once, a black bear got into his truck and ate his lunch right off the dashboard. He had stories. He had scars. But he didn't have an imagination. That was the thing about Ed. The man dealt in measurements, angles, elevations, soil grades. The world to him was a grid, and everything in it was either measurable or irrelevant. In the fall of 1994, the state of Oregon sent Ed and a small team into a stretch of the southern Cascade Mountains to survey a potential route for a new highway connector. The area was dense forest, mostly federal land, almost entirely unpopulated. At least that's what the records said. The project was routine. 3 weeks in the field. Map the terrain, assess the grades, flag any geological concerns, file a report. Nothing about it sounded unusual. The team was 4 people. Ed ran it. Rick Navarro handled the GPS equipment and topographic readings. He was ex-military, a quiet man who did his job and didn't ask a lot of questions. Donna Trask was the geologist. Smart, careful, the kind of person who noticed things other people walked past. And Paul Kim was the youngest, fresh out of school, there to log everything and carry whatever needed carrying. He was eager. That's the polite way to say he talked too much. They'd been in the field for 4 days when Ed's machete hit that gate. 4 days of nothing but trees and ridgelines and the usual grind. Then metal where no metal should have been. Now here's the thing. The gate shouldn't have been there. There was no road leading to it on any current survey map. No easement. No utility access point. No Forest Service marker. Nothing. When Donna checked the older geological charts she'd brought along, charts from the 1940s that she kept for reference, she found something odd. A narrow access road had once been marked in that exact spot. But it had been removed from every map printed after 1955. Not rerouted. Not downgraded. Removed. Like it had never existed. Ed radioed the district office. He told them they'd found a sealed access road and a gated entry point that wasn't on any current survey. The person on the other end told him to hold. He held for 20 minutes. When they came back, they told him to skip the area entirely and continue the survey along the northern ridge. No explanation. Just skip it. Ed didn't skip it. He told Rick to get the bolt cutters. They cut the chain and pushed the gate open. The hinges screamed loud enough to send birds scattering from the trees. Beyond the gate, the road dropped steeply through a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the afternoon light. The pavement, what was left of it, had cracked and buckled under decades of root growth. They walked single file for about half a mile, stepping over fallen branches and pushing through ferns that reached their waists. Then the canopy broke open, and the valley spread out below them. Believe me, nothing in Ed Calloway's 19 years of fieldwork prepared him for what he saw. The valley sat in a natural bowl, surrounded on all sides by steep, forested ridges. At its center was a small settlement, maybe 40 structures, wooden houses, most of them single-story, spaced out along 2 unpaved roads that crossed in the middle of town. A general store with a covered porch. A one-room schoolhouse with a bell still hanging in the eaves. A church with a white steeple that leaned slightly to the left, as if the wind had been pushing it for 40 years and it had almost given up fighting. All of it intact. All of it still standing. No collapsed roofs. No fire damage. No flood lines. No graffiti. No vandalism. No sign that any human being had set foot here since the day everyone left. The buildings had simply endured, held together by good lumber and the valley's sheltered geography. It looked like a town that had been put to sleep. It told the team to stick together. They entered from the north end, near the church. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the pews were still in rows. A Bible sat open on the pulpit, its pages swollen with moisture but still legible. Hymnals were stacked neatly on a shelf near the door. Dust covered everything in a fine gray layer, but underneath, the place looked ready for Sunday. They moved to the nearest house. The front door opened with a push. Inside, a kitchen table was set for 4. Plates, forks, glasses. A pot sat on the stove, long since dried to a black crust at the bottom. In the living room, a rocking chair faced the window. A pair of reading glasses rested on the arm. Upstairs, beds were made. Clothes hung in closets. A child's shoes sat by a bedroom door, side by side, toes pointing out, placed there the way a mother would set them before bed. No one had packed. No one had filled a suitcase or loaded a truck or bundled up their belongings. Whatever happened in this valley, it happened fast. And it happened to everyone at once. Donna found the first clock in that kitchen. A wind-up wall clock, stopped at 3:47. She noted it but didn't think much of it. Then Rick found one in the next house. Also stopped at 3:47. They checked a third house. Same. A fourth. Same. Pocket watch in a dresser drawer. A mantel clock in the general store. A small alarm clock on a child's nightstand. Every single timepiece in the settlement, all of them mechanical, all of them wound by hand, had stopped at exactly 3:47. It told Paul to start documenting everything. Every room. Every object. Every clock. He wanted a record before they touched a single thing. Paul pulled out his camera and started shooting, his hands not quite steady. By the time they reached the general store, the sun was getting low and the shadows in the valley were stretching long. The store shelves still held canned goods, jars of preserves, boxes of dry goods. A jar of penny candy sat on the counter. The candy inside fused together into a dark, solid lump. The register was closed. Behind the counter, a ledger lay open to the last page with writing on it. The final entry was dated November 12, 1954. That was the last recorded day Forgotten Valley existed. Ed found the first journal in a house near the eastern edge of the settlement. It was a woman's diary, leather-bound, the kind you'd buy at a general store for $1. The entries started in the spring of 1954 and ran through early November. Most of it was ordinary. Weather notes, shopping lists, mentions of neighbors coming by for coffee, recipes she wanted to try, the daily texture of a simple, isolated life. But somewhere around September, the tone changed. September 14th. Heard it again last night. Thomas says it's the creek, but the creek doesn't sound like that. It's too steady, too low. September 22nd. Martha won't let her children play near the old well anymore. She says they came back talking about a voice. I told her children make things up. She just looked at me. October 3rd. Pastor held a meeting after service. He told us to pray. That's all he said. Pray. He looked scared. I have known that man for 11 years and I have never seen him look scared. October 19th. Something is wrong with the ground. You can feel it in your feet if you stand still long enough. A hum. Thomas feels it too now. He pretends he doesn't. But I see him standing in the yard at night, just standing there, feeling it. November 2nd. They've started carving the marks. I don't know who started it first, but they're everywhere now. On the doors, on the fence posts, on the stones near the well. Nobody will say what they mean. Nobody will say who told them to do it. November 11th, the second to last entry. We're not leaving. That's what they decided. We can't leave. It follows. It's already followed Martha's sister to Bend. She heard it there too. Running doesn't work. So we stay. November 12th. The final entry. Just 3 words. It's beneath us. Ed read that journal twice. Then he put it in his pack and kept walking. Meanwhile, Donna was mapping the carvings. They were everywhere. Cut into door frames, porch railings, the sides of the church, the stones lining the well in the town center. The same symbols repeated. Circles with lines radiating outward. Triangles nested inside each other. Patterns that didn't match any indigenous or colonial marking system she'd ever studied. And she'd studied a lot of them. The carvings were deep, made with chisels and steady hands. This wasn't panic. This was deliberate. Paul found something worse in the schoolhouse. On the blackboard, still faintly visible under decades of chalk dust, someone had written a single line in large block letters. Do not dig. They met back at the schoolhouse at noon the next day, after a full morning of surveying. They shared everything they'd found. The journals, the carvings, the blackboard, the clocks. For a few minutes, nobody said anything. Then Donna sat down on the schoolhouse steps and unwrapped a granola bar. Rick leaned against the wall and drank from his canteen. He said something about the weather looking good for the afternoon. Paul sat on the ground and opened his notebook, started organizing his photograph log. Ed stood at the bottom of the steps, looking out over the valley. The sun was high. The settlement looked almost pleasant in the midday light. Quiet, still, like a postcard from a simpler time, the kind you'd find in an antique shop and think, that looks like a nice place to live. He took a deep breath. The worst was over, he told himself. They'd come in, they'd seen it, they'd document it, and they'd let the state figure out the rest. It was strange, sure, but it was old. 40 years old. Whatever had happened here, it was long finished. Dead history. There was nothing left to be afraid of. Then Donna stood up slowly. She was looking at the ground near the well. She walked over, knelt down, and touched something in the dirt. Ed, she said. Her voice had changed. These boot prints aren't 40 years old. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Ed walked over. She was right. In the soft earth near the well's edge, a set of boot prints pressed cleanly into the ground. Clear treads. Modern rubber soles. Recent. Days old. Maybe less. Someone had been standing right here at this well within the past week. Ed looked at the well cover. It had been moved. Not by much. Just a few inches off center. But enough to see that someone had slid it aside, looked down into the dark, and pushed it back. Now this is where everything changed. Because up until that moment, this was a mystery. A strange, unsettling historical puzzle. Something for a university team or a documentary crew to sort through. But standing there looking at fresh boot prints in a valley that had been sealed and classified and erased from every map for 40 years, Ed understood something that hit him like a fist. This wasn't history. Someone was actively coming here. Someone who knew about this place, who knew how to get past the gate, and who was interested in whatever lay beneath that well. This wasn't a dead story. It was alive. Rick wanted to leave. He said it straight. We file the report, we drive out, we let somebody with a badge deal with this. Paul agreed. Donna didn't say anything. She was staring at the well cover. It pulled rank. He said they'd check the well, document what they found, and then leave. 15 minutes. That was all. He walked over and pushed the cover the rest of the way off. The stone scraped against stone, and the sound echoed down into blackness. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because what comes next is the part nobody was ready for. The well was dry. No water at the bottom. Just darkness and cool air rising up from below. But there was a ladder. Iron rungs bolted into the stone wall, descending into the shaft. And the rungs weren't rusted. They were worn smooth from use. Decades of hands gripping the same iron, over and over. Ed went down first. He had a headlamp and a handheld flashlight. The shaft dropped about 30 feet, straight and narrow, and at the bottom it opened into a tunnel. Not a natural cave formation. Tunnel. Walls roughly cut from stone by human hands, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, tall enough to stand upright. The air was cool, damp, and carried a faint chemical smell, like old batteries, like ozone after a lightning strike. Donna came down next. She ran her fingers along the tunnel wall and stopped. Carvings. The same symbols from the surface, but down here they covered every inch. Floor to ceiling. Repeating in rows, spiraling around corners, layered on top of each other as if they'd been carved and recarved over years. Decades, maybe generations. Paul stayed at the top of the well with the radio. Rick stood halfway down the ladder, 1 foot on a rung, 1 hand on the wall. Close enough to hear them, far enough to climb out fast. Ed and Donna followed the tunnel east. It ran straight and level for about 200 yards. Their footsteps echoed off the stone. Neither of them spoke. About 50 yards in, Donna stopped and pointed her flashlight at the floor. Scratches. Long, parallel grooves worn into the rock, running the full length of the tunnel. Like something heavy had been dragged through here. Many times. Over many years. The grooves were deepest near the walls, as if whatever was being moved had been wide enough to scrape both sides. Ed knelt down and ran his thumb along one of the grooves. The stone inside was polished smooth. Whatever made these marks had passed through this tunnel hundreds of times. Maybe thousands. They kept walking. The air grew warmer the deeper they went. Not hot. Just warmer than it should have been 30 feet underground in November in Oregon. And the smell changed. That chemical edge got stronger. Donna said it smelled like iron and something else she couldn't place. Something organic. Something old. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber. The chamber was round, roughly 40 feet across, with a high ceiling braced by thick wooden beams that someone had installed with real craftsmanship. This wasn't a hole in the ground. This was a room, built with purpose, built to last. In the center sat a stone platform, about waist height, flat on top, the surface worn smooth from years of contact. Around it, arranged in a perfect circle, were chairs. Wooden chairs. Simple construction, sturdy, the kind a farmer would build in his barn. 42 of them, each one facing the platform. Each one set at the exact same distance from the center. On the platform sat objects. A bundle of cloth, folded neatly. A set of metal tools Ed didn't recognize. Instruments with no obvious purpose, their edges worn from handling. And a book. Large, leather-bound, handwritten in multiple inks by multiple hands across what appeared to be decades. Donna opened it carefully, turning the swollen pages with the tips of her fingers. It wasn't a Bible. It wasn't a diary. It was a log. Entries going back to 1912, each written by a different person, each recording observations and measurements taken in this chamber. The entries described sound frequencies emanating from below the chamber floor. Vibrations that increased at specific times of year. Seasonal patterns. Lunar correlations. Temperature changes that didn't match the surface weather. And references again and again to something they called the presence. Not a creature. Not a god. Not a spirit. Just the presence. Something below them. Something that hummed. The last entry in the log was dated November 12, 1954. Same date as the diary upstairs. Same date as the store ledger. It read, 42 souls committed. Descent begins at 3:47. I felt it then. Not fear exactly. Something colder. The kind of understanding that arrives all at once and rearranges everything you thought you knew. The clocks hadn't stopped on their own. They'd been set. Synchronized. 3:47 wasn't when time ran out for the valley. It was when something started. He looked down at the floor beneath the platform. There, fitted flush into the stone, was a hatch. Heavy stone construction with iron handles bolted to either side. It led further down. Into whatever down meant in a place like this. He didn't open it. Donna was already backing toward the tunnel. Ed, she said. Her voice was flat, controlled, almost too quiet. There's warm air coming up through that hatch. And it's moving. It stopped. He listened, and he heard it. Not the air itself. Something underneath the air. A low hum. Steady. Rhythmic. Not quite mechanical. Not quite natural. Something in between. Something that didn't fit into any category he could name. It pulsed like a heartbeat, but slower, deeper. as if the mountain itself was breathing. It was coming from below the hatch, and it was constant, and now that he'd heard it, he couldn't unhear it. It filled the chamber, filled his chest. He could feel it in his teeth. They left. Up through the tunnel, up the ladder, out of the well. Paul was standing at the top, pale, holding the radio in both hands. He said it had stopped working 10 minutes earlier. No signal. Not static. Total silence on every frequency. Like the signal itself had been swallowed. Rick was already packing his gear. Ed didn't argue this time. They covered the well, gathered everything, and walked out of the valley in a tight group. Nobody ran. But nobody stopped moving either. They hit the gate by late afternoon, climbed through, and didn't stop until they reached the trucks a mile and a half out. Ed filed his report the following Monday morning. 14 pages. Maps, photographs, GPS coordinates, transcriptions from the diary and the underground log. He submitted it to his district supervisor and copied the state land management office. The response came 3 days later. A man Ed had never met walked into his office without knocking. No state ID. No name badge. Dark suit, briefcase, no small talk. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't shake Ed's hand. He sat down across from Ed's desk like he owned the chair and told him the survey area had been reassigned. The southern route was no longer under consideration. Ed's report would not be filed publicly. The photographs would be returned. Ed himself would be reassigned to a project in eastern Oregon, effective immediately. Ed asked why. The man didn't answer. Ed asked who he worked for. The man said it wasn't relevant. Ed asked about the valley, about the settlement, about the people who had lived there. The man said there was no valley. Ed stared at him. Then he pointed at his own 14-page report sitting right there on the desk between them, with its maps and photographs and GPS coordinates and transcribed journal entries. The man picked it up without looking at it, slid it into his briefcase, snapped the clasps shut, and stood. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "the land you surveyed is federal property under restricted classification. There is no settlement. There are no structures. There is no well. Your team entered an area they were not authorized to enter. This meeting is your notification that the matter is closed. There will be no follow-up. There will be no inquiry. You will not discuss this with colleagues, press, or anyone outside your immediate team. Am I clear?" Ed said nothing. The man took that as agreement. He walked out. Ed never saw the report again. And when he checked the district office files a week later, there was no record that a survey of the Southern Cascade Corridor had ever been assigned. Now here's what happened after. Rick Navarro transferred to a private surveying firm within the month. He never spoke publicly about the valley. Not once. Not to journalists, not to friends, not even to his wife as far as anyone knows. Donna Trask went back to her university lab and took a 3-month leave of absence. She spent that time digging through historical land records for the Southern Cascades region. She found that the valley had appeared on maps as early as 1889. A small, isolated community of settlers had lived there for more than 60 years. No formal incorporation, no postal route, no school district affiliation. They existed entirely off the grid before that phrase meant anything. She also found a reference in a 1955 internal memo from the Bureau of Land Management. The memo mentioned a voluntary relocation of residents from an unnamed mountain valley due to geological instability. But no relocation records existed. No receiving community was ever listed. No follow-up inspection was conducted. The memo was filed and never referenced again. Paul Kim kept personal copies of his photographs. He'd made duplicates before Ed submitted the report, a move that turned out to be the only reason any physical evidence survived. For years, he kept them in a shoebox in his closet. He didn't look at them often, but he didn't throw them away either. In 2003, 9 years after the trip, Paul showed the photographs to a journalist named Sandra Reyes. She was writing a series on abandoned places in the Pacific Northwest, and a mutual friend connected them. Paul met her at a diner in Portland and spread the photographs across the table. The settlement, the church, the kitchen with its table set for 4, the clocks, all frozen at 3:47. The carvings, the blackboard with its chalked warning, and one photograph from inside the well shaft, looking down, showing the iron rungs disappearing into darkness. Sandra published a piece in a regional magazine. She framed it mostly as a curiosity. Abandoned settlements weren't unusual out here. Logging towns, mining camps, homesteads that didn't survive a bad winter. But Paul told her the thing that made this one different wasn't what they'd found on the surface. It was what lay beneath it. The chamber. The chairs arranged in their circle. The log spanning 40 years of entries. The hatch they chose not to open. And the hum. He said he could still feel it. Not in his ears. In his chest. In his ribs. A vibration that had settled into his bones the day he stood at the top of that well and never fully left. Came and went. Some days he barely noticed it. Other days it woke him at 3 in the morning, and he'd lie in bed listening to something that wasn't sound exactly, more like the memory of sound, playing on repeat inside his own body. Sandra wanted more. She drove out to find the valley herself. She followed the old forest road, found the turnoff Ed had described, and drove about a mile before she hit a fence. Chain link, 8 feet high, razor wire across the top. Signs posted every 20 feet. Department of the Interior. No trespassing. No photography. No entry under any circumstances. The fence was new. The posts were sunk in concrete. Whoever put it up had done it recently, and they'd done it to last. She filed a Freedom of Information request for any records related to the valley or its residents. Denied. She appealed. Denied again. Both times the same reason: national security. Ed Calloway retired in 2001. He moved to a small house on the Oregon coast, a place where the ocean was loud and constant and filled up every silence. He told people he liked the sound of the waves. That was true. But people who knew him well understood that the noise served another purpose. Covered something. Drowned out a frequency that Ed never talked about but never stopped hearing. He didn't discuss the valley for years. He turned down 2 documentary producers and a book author. He told them he had nothing to say. But in 2012, when he was 74 years old and starting to feel the weight of carrying a secret for nearly 2 decades, he sat down with a local historian named Claire Yoshida and gave a recorded interview that ran almost 3 hours. Claire had heard about the valley through Donna Trask, who had quietly shared some of her research with academic colleagues over the years. None of it was published. None of it was on the record. But stories travel even when the people telling them ask you to keep quiet. Ed described the chamber one more time. The chairs arranged in their perfect circle. The stone platform at the center worn smooth. The log with its decades of entries in dozens of different handwritings, each one recording the same observations, the same measurements, the same slow escalation of a phenomenon nobody could explain. The hatch in the floor that he chose not to open. And the sound. He spent a long time talking about the sound. He said the hum wasn't threatening, wasn't aggressive, wasn't loud. It was patient. That was the word he kept coming back to, the one he circled around and returned to every time he tried to describe it. Patient. Like it had been there for a very long time and would be there for a lot longer and was in absolutely no hurry about anything at all. He said it didn't feel hostile. Felt aware. That distinction mattered to him. He said the thing that had stayed with him wasn't the mystery of what happened to the residents. It was the arithmetic. The last line of the log said 42 souls. He'd counted the chairs in the chamber. 42. And the population of the valley, according to the oldest records Donna had found, was 42. Every man, woman, and child. He believed the residents hadn't been taken, hadn't fled, hadn't been relocated by any government agency. He believed they'd gone down, together, willingly, through that hatch into whatever lay beneath, drawn by a force that had been humming under their feet for as long as any of them could remember. Maybe longer than any of them had been alive. And whatever that force was, it was still humming. The historian asked him one last question. She asked if he'd ever thought about going back. Ed was quiet for a long time. The recording picks up the sound of the ocean outside his window. Then he said something that ended the interview. The gate isn't there to keep people out. I figured that out years later. The carvings, the symbols, the writing on the blackboard. None of it was a warning to outsiders. It was a seal, a boundary. The 42 didn't go down because they were afraid. They went down because they understood something the rest of us don't. Something was waking up beneath that valley, and they believed the only way to keep it there was to go down and hold it in place. With their bodies, with their presence. 42 people, sitting in 42 chairs, in a circle, in the dark, holding something still. He folded his hands on the table. And I wonder, he said, how long 42 people can hold. Nobody has entered Forgotten Valley since. The fence stands. The signs are posted. The restricted classification has never been lifted. And somewhere, deep beneath a quiet stretch of Oregon mountains, in a chamber carved by hands that have long since gone still, something continues to hum. Patient, steady, unchanged. Some doors stay closed for a reason, and some questions are better left in the ground where you found them.